The gunshot cracked through the quiet of the county fairgrounds, just as the Ferris wheel creaked into its slow evening rotation. And for a moment nobody moved because the sound seemed too sharp, too final, to belong to a place that smelled like funnel cake and fried corn dogs. But then a teenage girl screamed, and the crowd broke apart like a wave smashing against rocks, while Deputy Mark Ellison stood frozen beside the lemonade stand, with the paper cup still halfway to his mouth, because he recognized the man who had fallen face first into the gravel beside the livestock pavilion. And that recognition was the thing that locked his legs in place, because the man bleeding out on the ground, with his shirt already turning dark, was Caleb Whitaker, the same man Mark had grown up with, the same man who had been his best friend since they were 9 years old and building tree forts behind the abandoned grain elevator outside Cedar Ridge, Kansas. Someone shouted, "Call 911," even though half the people there already had their phones out, and another voice yelled that the shooter ran toward the parking lot. But Mark still couldn't move because his brain was doing something strange, pulling up memories that had nothing to do with the moment, like the time Caleb stole his dad's pickup when they were 17 and drove them both 3 counties over just to see a girl he barely knew, or the night they sat on the hood of that same pickup drinking warm beer and talking about how they'd never turn into the kind of men who stayed stuck in Cedar Ridge forever. Caleb's hand twitched against the dirt. That broke the spell. Mark dropped the lemonade and pushed through the crowd, shouting, "Move, Sheriff's Department," even though technically he was only a deputy, and even though technically he wasn't on duty tonight. But nobody questioned him, because the badge on his belt was enough to part the sea of frightened families. When he knelt beside Caleb, the smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. Caleb was breathing in short, wet bursts. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Mark pressed both hands against the wound in Caleb's chest and said, "Stay with me. Hey, Caleb, stay with me." Caleb's eyes fluttered open, and for a split second, there was something almost amused in them. The same crooked humor Mark remembered from high school football games and late nights behind the diner. Caleb tried to speak. Only a rasp came out. Mark leaned closer. "What?" Caleb swallowed hard, coughed blood, and forced the words through clenched teeth. "You shouldn't have come back." Mark frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Caleb's fingers grabbed Mark's shirt with surprising strength. "They're watching." Then his grip loosened, and his eyes lost focus in a way Mark had seen too many times on too many bodies over the past 8 years working county patrol. Behind him, the distant wail of sirens finally cut through the chaos. Mark kept pressing down on the wound even though he already knew it didn't matter. His hands were shaking now. Someone nearby whispered, "Is he dead?" Mark didn't answer because the question felt like an accusation. 30 minutes later, the fairgrounds looked like a crime scene from a TV show. Yellow tape stretched between metal fence posts, while state troopers walked the dirt with flashlights, and deputies interviewed witnesses under the harsh glow of portable floodlights. Sheriff Don Halvorson stood beside Mark near the patrol trucks, arms crossed over his heavy chest, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. "You say you didn't see the shooter," Halvorson said. Mark shook his head. "Just heard the shot." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "Funny thing about that." Mark looked up. "What?" Halvorson nodded toward the gravel lot beyond the fair gates, where a line of dusty pickups sat under flickering streetlights. "Witness says the shooter was already running before the crowd even reacted, like he knew exactly where to go." Mark shrugged. "Maybe he scoped the place out." Halvorson didn't look convinced. "Maybe." The sheriff leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You and Caleb still tight these days?" The question hit harder than Mark expected. "Not really." Halvorson raised an eyebrow. "Not really?" Mark sighed. "We hadn't talked in months." That was technically true, but it wasn't the whole truth, and the weight of that omission pressed against his ribs like something alive. Halvorson nodded slowly. "Still strange." "What is?" "You being the first one to reach him." Mark let out a breath. "I was 10 feet away." "Yeah." The sheriff's eyes drifted toward the livestock pavilion, where investigators were still photographing the blood-stained gravel. "And you're the last person he talked to before he died." The words settled between them like smoke. Mark rubbed the dried blood on his hands, wishing the night air would swallow the memory of Caleb's voice, whispering that warning. "They're watching." "Did he say anything?" Halvorson asked quietly. Mark hesitated. For a moment he considered repeating the words exactly as Caleb had spoken them, but something stopped him. Instinct, maybe. Or fear. "No," he said finally. "Just told me to tell his sister he loved her." The sheriff watched him carefully, searching for cracks in the lie, but Mark kept his face still. After a long pause, Halvorson nodded once. "All right." The sheriff turned and walked toward the command trailer, leaving Mark alone beside the patrol truck. The night felt colder now. Somewhere beyond the parking lot, a generator hummed steadily. Mark stared out across the dark fields surrounding Cedar Ridge and tried to convince himself that what Caleb had said was just the delirium of a dying man. But the problem was that Caleb had never sounded delirious. He'd sounded certain. And Caleb Whitaker had never been the kind of man who said things without a reason. 2 hours later, Mark sat alone in the back booth of Rosie's Diner on Highway 14, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold while the neon open sign flickered against the front window. Rosie herself stood behind the counter, wiping glasses and pretending not to watch him too closely. News traveled fast in Cedar Ridge. Everyone already knew someone had been shot at the fair. Mark stared at the reflection of his own tired face in the chrome napkin holder. 8 years he'd been a deputy. 8 years handling drunk drivers, bar fights, domestic calls. But this felt different, because Caleb wasn't just another body. Caleb was part of his history, part of every memory tied to growing up in this town. The bell above the diner door jingled. Mark looked up as Lisa Whitaker stepped inside, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail and her eyes already red from crying. She walked straight to his booth without ordering anything. "Is it true?" she asked. Mark nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Lisa." She sat down across from him, gripping the edge of the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. "They said you were with him." Mark swallowed. "I got there right after." Lisa stared at him, searching his face the same way the sheriff had earlier. "Did he suffer?" Mark hesitated before answering. "No." Another lie. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Did he say anything?" The question tightened something in Mark's chest. "Just asked me to tell you he loved you." Lisa closed her eyes, and tears slipped down her cheeks. "That sounds like him." Mark watched her struggle to breathe steadily. After a moment, she wiped her face and looked back at him. "Do they know who did it?" "Not yet." Lisa shook her head. Caleb didn't have enemies. Mark almost said something then, almost told her about the warning, about the strange certainty in Caleb's final words, but before he could speak, the bell above the diner door rang again. Both of them turned. A tall man stepped inside wearing a gray jacket and jeans, his hair cut short in a way that looked almost military. He paused near the entrance, scanning the room with calm, deliberate eyes before settling his gaze on Mark. The stranger walked over slowly. "Deputy Ellison?" Mark frowned. "Yeah." The man extended a hand. "Name's Daniel Rourke." Mark shook it cautiously. The grip was firm. "What can I do for you?" Rourke glanced briefly at Lisa, then back to Mark. "Mind if we talk outside?" Mark felt a ripple of unease move through him. "About what?" Rourke's expression remained neutral. "About Caleb Whitaker." Lisa stiffened beside him. "Who are you?" Rourke hesitated, then reached into his jacket and flashed a small badge too quickly for either of them to read clearly. "Federal." Mark narrowed his eyes. "Federal what?" Rourke smiled faintly. "That's not important right now." Mark leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms. "It's important to me." Rourke studied him for a long second before speaking again. "Let's just say Caleb Whitaker was involved in something bigger than a county fair shooting." The words hung in the diner air like thunder waiting to break. Lisa looked between them, confusion turning slowly into fear. "What are you talking about?" Rourke ignored her question. His eyes stayed locked on Mark. "Deputy Ellison, if Caleb said anything unusual before he died, I strongly suggest you tell me now." Mark's pulse quickened. For the first time since the gunshot at the fairgrounds, Caleb's last words echoed through his head with chilling clarity. "They're watching." Mark met Rourke's gaze and felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him, the kind of decision that could change everything about how this night ended. "No," he said quietly. He didn't say anything unusual. Rourke watched him for several seconds without blinking, as if measuring the lie. Then he nodded once. "All right." He turned and walked out of the diner without another word. The bell above the door jingled again. Silence filled the booth. Lisa whispered, "Mark, what the hell is going on?" Mark didn't answer because deep down, he already knew the worst part of the night wasn't the moment Caleb died. The worst part was the feeling creeping slowly into his gut now. The realization that Caleb's warning might not have been about the man who pulled the trigger at the fair. It might have been about someone much closer. And the thought landed so hard in Mark's chest that for a second he could not breathe right. Lisa was still staring at him across the table, waiting for an answer he did not have or maybe did not want to say out loud. Rosie pretended to rearrange pie slices in the display case, but the whole diner had gone into that strained small-town silence, where everybody knows something is wrong, and nobody wants to be the first one to touch it. Mark reached for his coffee, realized his hand was trembling, and set it back down. "I don't know what's going on," he said, which was true enough to sound honest. Lisa wiped under her eyes with the heel of her palm. "Federal?" Caleb? She gave a bitter little laugh that broke halfway through. He could barely keep his truck insured. Mark looked toward the door where Rourke had disappeared. People get mixed up in things. Lisa leaned forward. Was he in trouble? I don't know. That's not what I asked. Mark met her eyes and saw the desperation under the anger. Lisa had spent most of her adult life cleaning up pieces of Caleb's messes, from overdue rent notices, to drunken calls at 2 in the morning, to the kind of broken-hearted apologies that only came after the damage was done. She knew better than anyone that Caleb was capable of trouble. What frightened her now was the possibility that this was something worse than the usual. He'd been different lately, she said quietly. Jumpy, distracted. He kept checking over his shoulder like somebody was following him. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. Why didn't you tell me that? Lisa let out a breath. Tell you what? That my brother was acting weird? Around here, that doesn't exactly narrow things down. Mark almost smiled, but it died before it fully formed. Did he say anything specific? No, he just kept saying he was trying to fix something. Her voice thinned. You know how Caleb talked when he wanted to sound like he had a plan. Mark did know. Caleb could sell hope like it was a product. Even when they were kids, he had that gift of sounding convinced enough for both people. In high school, he talked Mark into sneaking out, cutting class, driving to Wichita on a school night, asking girls way out of their league. Later, he talked men into poker games, contractors into giving him one more week to pay, women into believing he was finally done running from himself. Did he owe anybody money? Mark asked. Lisa looked away. Always. Anybody serious? You mean dangerous? She shook her head. If I knew that, I would have been dragging him out of town myself. Rosie approached the booth with a fresh pot of coffee, though nobody had asked for it. You two need anything else? She said softly. Mark glanced up. Rosie's face had the careful sympathy of someone who had seen this town grieve too many times. No, thanks. She poured anyway, set the pot down, and squeezed Lisa's shoulder before returning to the counter. Lisa stared into the dark coffee like she might find Caleb in the reflection. He came by my place 3 nights ago, she said. Late. After midnight. Mark stayed still. What did he want? He asked if I still had Dad's lockbox. That caught Mark's attention. The metal one? Lisa nodded. The one with the busted latch. He used to keep cash in it when he was pretending to be responsible. Did you give it to him? Did you give it to him? No. I told him I'd thrown it out after Dad died. She paused. That was a lie. It's still in my hall closet. Mark frowned. Why'd you lie? Lisa's eyes sharpened. Because he looked scared, Mark. The diner's humming lights seemed suddenly louder. Scared how? Like the kind of scared where somebody's trying not to show it. He kept looking through my blinds. He asked if anybody had been by asking about him. Mark sat back. And I told him no. She swallowed. Then he said if anything happened, I shouldn't trust anybody who acted too helpful. Her voice broke on the last word. I thought he was high. Mark stared at her. In the booth behind him, somebody's fork scraped a plate. It sounded distant, like it belonged to another world. Why didn't you tell the sheriff that? He asked. Lisa gave him a flat look. Because I don't know what it means, and because around here the sheriff's known Caleb since he was a boy. What was I supposed to say? That my messed up brother said something creepy before he got himself killed? Mark looked down at his hands. The dried blood was still lodged in the creases of his knuckles. He had washed them twice in the diner restroom, but some of it remained, stubborn as guilt. You still have the lockbox? He asked. Lisa nodded slowly. At home. Mark made the decision before he fully examined it. I want to see it. Tonight? Yeah. She searched his face. You think there's something in it? I think Caleb was trying to leave something somewhere safe. Lisa looked toward the front window, where the parking lot lay under sickly yellow light. And what if that federal guy's right? About what? About Caleb being wrapped up in something bigger. Mark stood, dropping cash on the table for the coffee. Then we don't wait around for someone else to come get there first. They drove separately through the dark streets of Cedar Ridge, past the shuttered hardware store, the Baptist church, with its glowing cross sign, the little county courthouse square, where a bronze Civil War statue stood under a cottonwood tree. On any other night, the town would have felt familiar, almost dull. Tonight, every parked car looked like it might contain someone watching. Every porch light seemed too bright or too deliberate. Mark kept checking his rearview mirror as he drove his truck behind Lisa's taillights toward the older west side of town, where the houses sat closer together and the paint peeled a little more each year. Lisa lived in a narrow white bungalow she'd inherited from their mother, with a sagging porch and potted mums gone brown from neglect. When Mark stepped out of his truck, the November air bit through his jacket. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then stopped. Lisa unlocked the front door and motioned him inside. The house smelled faintly of laundry, soap, and old coffee. Family pictures lined the hallway, most of them from a version of the Whitakers that didn't exist anymore. Their father, younger and broad-shouldered in work boots. Their mother smiling with the hard, tired grace of women who keep households alive on bad money. Lisa in a choir dress, Caleb grinning with a split lip after a football game. Mark paused at one frame near the living room entrance. It showed him and Caleb at 18, shirtless and sunburned on the bank of Miller's Creek, both of them holding fish and laughing at something outside the frame. Lisa noticed where he was looking. Mom liked you better than half the men Caleb brought around. That's not a high bar. No. She disappeared into the hallway closet and came back with a dented gray metal box the size of not a high. A large tackle kit. The latch was bent. A strip of old duct tape still clung to one corner. This thing? She said. Mark took it from her. It was lighter than he expected. You got anything to pry it? She returned with a flathead screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. Mark worked the blade under the warped latch while Lisa hovered close enough for him to feel her tension. After a minute, the metal gave with a sharp pop. Inside were a few old receipts, a pawnshop ticket dated 2 years ago, a photograph of Caleb and their father standing beside a deer carcass, and, tucked beneath a folded flannel rag, a cheap prepaid flip phone. Lisa stared. That wasn't in there before. Mark picked it up. The battery was still inside. You sure? I cleaned that box out after Dad passed. There was no phone. Mark turned it over in his palm. No brand marking beyond a scratched service logo. No case. Just a throwaway phone. The kind people used when they didn't want to be found. He flipped it open. The screen glowed weakly. One missed call. No contact name. The timestamp read, 6:41 p.m. Less than an hour before Caleb was shot. Lisa whispered, Jesus. Mark checked the inbox. Empty. He opened recent messages. One unsent draft sat there with no recipient attached. It read, If anything happens to me, look under the floor in the garage. Mark read it twice before handing the phone to Lisa. Her mouth tightened as she scanned the message. Garage? She said. He meant Dad's old garage? Probably. Their father's property sat 5 miles outside town, an aging farmhouse and detached cinderblock garage, left mostly unused after the old man died of a heart attack 18 months earlier. Caleb was supposed to help Lisa sell it. Instead, he dragged his feet, saying he needed time to sort through tools, scrap, old hunting gear. Mark had been out there once in the spring to help haul off rotten fencing. He remembered the garage floor was cracked concrete with oil stains older than either of them. We should call the sheriff, Lisa said, but the words came out uncertain, as if she already knew she did not believe them. Mark thought of Halverson's face in the floodlights, of the way he had asked what Caleb said, with careful eyes, and a voice too casual to be casual. He thought of Rourke appearing at the diner within what? An hour of the shooting. Too fast for ordinary federal business. Too fast unless somebody had been keeping tabs on Caleb already. Not yet, Mark said. Lisa's expression hardened. You don't trust Halvorson. It wasn't really a question. Mark took a slow breath. I don't know who to trust. That answer landed heavily between them because both of them knew it included each other. At least a little. Lisa folded her arms, trying to steady herself. You think my brother was dirty. I think your brother was scared. That's not the same thing. No, Mark said. It's not. For a moment, they just stood there in the cramped living room. Two people tied to the same dead man in different ways, trying to decide whether grief made allies or enemies. Lisa looked back at the phone. If there's something under that garage floor, somebody else might already know about it. Then we go now. She glanced toward the dark window. At midnight? Before anybody can beat us there. She nodded once, the decision snapping into place with the kind of hard practicality small-town people develop early. Fine, but I'm coming. Lisa, don't. Her voice sharpened. Do not tell me to stay behind like this is some movie. He was my brother. Mark held up a hand. All right. 10 minutes later, they were back on the road. This time in Mark's truck, because neither of them wanted two vehicles parked at the old Whitaker place like a beacon. The county highway ran black and empty through harvested fields silvered by moonlight. Grain silos rose in the distance like blunt sentries. Lisa sat stiffly in the passenger seat holding the flip phone in both hands. The cab heater clicked and rattled. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Lisa said, You lied in the diner. Mark kept his eyes on the road. About what? About Caleb's last words. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. Why do you think that? Because when you lie, you look like you're trying too hard not to blink. He almost laughed at that, but again the sound died before it reached daylight. You always noticed that? Since we were kids. She turned toward the window. You were a terrible liar at 16. I got better. No, she said quietly. You just got older. Mark drove another mile before he answered. He said, You shouldn't have come back. Then he said, They're watching. Lisa turned sharply. What? That's what he said. And you didn't think maybe I should know that? I didn't know what it meant. You still don't. Exactly. She stared at him, hurt and fury mixing together. What does come back mean? Mark swallowed. That question had been clawing at him since the fairground gravel. He had moved back to Cedar Ridge 9 months earlier after his divorce in Topeka went from bad to unlivable. On paper, it was simple. His ex-wife Erin wanted out. She said Mark had become a man who knew how to show up for strangers in uniform, but not for his own house. She was not completely wrong. After the papers were signed and the apartment felt like a storage unit for a ruined life, Mark took a transfer back to his home county because Halvorson offered steady work and because Cedar Ridge was the one place he thought he understood. He and Caleb had started talking again only a few months after Mark returned. Not constantly, mostly late-night calls and chance meetings behind the gas station or at Rosie's, the kind of half-friendship men rebuild without ever naming the wound underneath it. But there was more history there, too much of it, and some of it ugly. Mark, Lisa's voice pulled him back. What did he mean? The headlights swept across a mailbox leaning crooked by the roadside. Mark said, Maybe he meant I should have stayed gone. Why? He hesitated. Because the last time Caleb and I were really close, things got bad. Lisa gave a short, humorless breath. That narrows it down even less. He knew she deserved more. The problem was, once he started speaking, he might not know how to stop. The truck rolled over a cattle guard with a hard metallic clank. When I was 22, he said, Caleb got mixed up with some guys stealing copper wire off construction sites. Not big-time organized crime. Just local idiots trying to make quick cash. Lisa said nothing. The silence asked him to keep going. I was in the police academy then. He got picked up one night with stolen material in the bed of his truck. Sheriff's office was ready to charge him and the others. Lisa's voice went flat. And Halvorson came to me. He said if Caleb cooperated, testified against the ringleader, maybe they could cut him some slack. Lisa closed her eyes. You convinced him. Yeah. And the ringleader. Mark's jaw worked. Name was Wes Barlow. Lisa stiffened. Barlow from the salvage yard? He owned it then. Owned, she repeated, catching the tense. He died in prison 3 years ago. Mark nodded once. But before he went away, Caleb got the blame from half the county for turning on his own people. Barlow's cousins, friends, hangers-on. Folks who already thought Caleb was weak. Lisa looked stunned and disgusted all at once. So you made him a snitch. I made him avoid 5 years in prison. And what did it cost him? Mark had no answer. That didn't sound like self-defense. The truck cab filled with the old ache of a choice that had once felt righteous and now just felt unfinished. Finally, he said, He hated me for a while. Lisa laughed bitterly. For a while? Mark. He came home drunk one Christmas and punched a hole through my kitchen door because somebody at the VFW called him rat blood. Mark looked at her, stunned. He never told me that. Of course he didn't. Why would he? The farmhouse came into view then, a dark shape at the end of a dirt drive lined with dead grass and rusted fence posts. The porch sagged worse than Mark remembered. The detached garage stood 50 yards back, square and low against the moonlit field. He killed the headlights, and the truck rolled to a stop in near total darkness. Neither of them moved for a second. You still want to do this? He asked. Lisa opened the door. No, she said. But I'm going. Gravel crunched under their boots. The cold hit harder out here away from town. The farmhouse windows were black. A wind moved through the dry weeds by the ditch with a sound like whispering. Mark unlatched the truck's utility box and pulled out 2 flashlights and a pry bar. He handed one light to Lisa. She took it without speaking. They crossed the yard toward the garage, their beams cutting across broken lawn equipment and an old tire rim half sunk in mud. The side door to the garage was already open by 3 inches. Mark stopped. Lisa nearly walked into him. What? She whispered. He angled the flashlight toward the door. The lock plate hung twisted, fresh splinters pale against the dark wood. Somebody had forced it. Lisa breathed. Oh my God. Mark stepped in front of her automatically. Stay behind me. This time she did not argue. He pushed the door wider with the pry bar. The smell hit first. Old motor oil and cold concrete and something sharper underneath, like fresh dirt. His flashlight swept across tool pegboards. A riding mower, missing a wheel. Shelves stacked with paint cans and mason jars of screws. Then it landed on the floor near the back workbench. A square section of concrete had been jackhammered open. Chunks lay piled to one side. The soil beneath was dug out into a shallow pit. Empty. Lisa let out a small broken sound. Mark moved slowly toward the hole, crouched, and touched the dirt. Loose. Recently turned. Somebody had been here very recently. Maybe within hours. A generator cable snaked across the floor from a portable demolition hammer still plugged into the wall outlet. Whoever opened the floor had either been interrupted or left in a hurry. On the workbench sat a single object that had not belonged to the old chaos of the garage. A brown manila envelope, neatly placed under a wrench. Mark felt his pulse thudding in his throat. He picked it up. Across the front, in Caleb's blocky handwriting, were 3 words. For Mark only. Lisa saw it and swore under her breath. He knew you'd come. Mark did not answer. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded stack of papers and a small flash drive taped to an index card. The first paper was a photocopy of county land records. Several parcels on the south edge of Cedar Ridge were circled in red. Another page showed bank transfers between a regional development company Mark had never heard of, and 3 local entities he did recognize. Halvorson Excavation, the Cedar Ridge Volunteer Booster Fund, and the Sheriff's Office Asset Forfeiture Account. Mark's mouth went dry. Lisa stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. What is that? I don't know yet. But one name at the top of the transfer sheet stood out like a bruise. Don Halvorson Holdings, LLC. Same last name. Same county. Maybe not proof of anything by itself, except the sheriff had once claimed he had no side businesses left after his brother's construction company folded years ago. Mark flipped to the last page. It was handwritten. If you're reading this, I ran out of time. I wasn't skimming. I swear that on Mama's grave. They're buying land through dummies ahead of the state water project. Sheriff's in it. So is Judge Pritchard. Maybe more. They've been leaning on people to sell cheap, then flipping options before announcement. I found out because Wes's old people started moving cash again. I took copies because I thought I could force my way in, make enough to get clear. Then they figured out what I had. Don't give this to anybody local. Don't trust the deputies. Don't trust anybody who says they can handle it quietly. There was no signature, just Caleb's writing slashing hard across the page, as if he had been angry or afraid when he finished. Lisa whispered, Sheriff Halvorson? Mark read the note again, slower this time, hearing Caleb's voice in the phrasing, the self-justification and fear all tangled together. I wasn't skimming, which meant he had considered it, maybe had done more than consider. Lisa took a shaky step back. This is insane. Maybe. Maybe? She pointed at the papers. That says the sheriff is dirty. It says Caleb thought he was. You think Caleb made this up? Mark looked at the dugout floor. No, I think somebody came here tonight because they believed there was something worth taking. He glanced toward the open side door, the busted lock, the yard beyond. The cold air moving in now felt hostile, alert. We need to go. Lisa's voice rose. Go where? Somewhere not here. And do what? He shoved the papers and flash drive back into the envelope. Figure out who we can trust outside the county. The federal guy. Mark considered that. Daniel Rourke had shown up too fast and asked the right question too directly, but if he already knew enough to ask, why had Caleb ended up dead at a county fair? Maybe, Mark said. Maybe not. Lisa stared at him, disbelief edging toward panic. You still don't get to do that. You don't get to stand there acting like this is one of your cases. My brother is dead. The words hit with enough force that Mark almost flinched. She was crying now, but her voice stayed steady in a way that was somehow worse. All these years, you and Caleb had your own private war. You saved him, betrayed him, judged him, defended him. Whatever version makes you sleep at night. But he's still dead. Mark looked at her, at the wet shine on her face, and for the first time that night he let himself feel the full shape of it. Caleb dead on gravel. Caleb leaving a note because he knew he was running out of options. Caleb still choosing Mark, after all the resentment and history and unfinished damage. I know, he said, and his voice came out rough. No, Lisa snapped. You don't. Because if you did, you'd stop trying to manage this and admit you're scared. Mark opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped. She was right. He was scared. Not just of Halvorson or the papers or whoever had dug up the garage floor. He was scared of what it meant if Caleb's last real act had been to trust him, because Mark had spent half his life failing the people who trusted him most. Before he could answer, headlights swept suddenly across the garage door windows, bright and blinding. Lisa gasped. Mark killed his flashlight instantly and grabbed her arm, pulling her behind the workbench as gravel crunched in the yard outside. A truck engine idled. Then another set of headlights appeared, crossing the first. Doors slammed. Male voices, low and hard to make out. Mark's heart kicked into a hard, punishing rhythm. Lisa's hand clamped around his sleeve. He leaned close to her ear. "Don't move." Through the dirty garage window, he saw silhouettes crossing the yard. 3 of them at least, maybe 4. One beam of light flashed across the busted side door. A man's voice drifted in, calm and familiar enough to turn Mark's blood cold. "Check inside. If somebody beat us here, I want to know who." Sheriff Don Halvorson. Sheriff Don Halvorson. And the sound of his voice in the yard outside made something old and primitive tighten in Mark's spine because it took the fear out of theory and pinned it to a man he had known since he was 19, a man who had taught him how to write a clean incident report, and once helped carry his father's coffin to the church steps when Mark's knees nearly gave out. Another beam sliced across the garage wall. Boots crunched through broken concrete near the side entrance. Mark lowered himself into a crouch, one arm spread protectively in front of Lisa, though he knew it would do almost nothing if bullets started flying. He could hear Halvorson talking to someone just beyond the doorway. "I'm telling you, he didn't say anything useful before he died." A second voice answered, younger, strained. "Then why are we out here?" "Because I don't like loose ends." Mark's jaw clenched. That second voice belonged to Deputy Travis Boone, 26 years old, eager, local, the kind of guy who still called older officers sir, even off duty. Mark had trained him last winter. That hurt more than it should have. The side door creaked wider. A flashlight beam swept the garage floor, passing just inches from Mark's boot before moving on. Travis stepped in first, service pistol drawn low, shoulders tense. Behind him came another man in a county deputy jacket, Mark recognized only after a second as Leon Mercer, part-time reserve, broad-faced and usually sleepy-eyed, now wide-awake and dangerous-looking. Halvorson entered last with no gun visible, which somehow made him seem more dangerous. He carried himself like the room already belonged to him. "Hell," Mercer muttered, staring at the broken floor. "Somebody got here." Halvorson's gaze moved methodically over the pit, the jackhammer, the workbench. "Search it." Travis stepped farther inside. Mark could hear Lisa trying to breathe quietly beside him, but fear has a sound all its own, and he was sure these men could hear it too. His hand closed around the pry bar. It was a stupid weapon against firearms, but it was what he had. The manila envelope pressed against his ribs inside his jacket. He had one chance, maybe less. Travis's flashlight beam jumped toward the workbench and then angled behind it. Mark moved before the light found them. He lunged up and swung the pry bar hard into Travis's wrist. Bone cracked, or maybe the flashlight did. Travis yelled and his gun discharged into the ceiling with a deafening bang. Mercer shouted. Lisa screamed. Mark drove his shoulder into Travis's chest, sending both of them crashing sideways into a shelf of paint cans. Halvorson roared, "Jesus Christ," and reached for his weapon. Lisa grabbed the fallen flashlight and hurled it straight at Mercer's face. He flinched, cursing, and that half-second was enough for Mark to seize Travis's dropped pistol off the concrete. He came up aiming. "Don't," he shouted. Halvorson froze with his own gun half-drawn, eyes blazing under the brim of his hat. Mercer had a hand over his nose, blood running between his fingers. Travis was on the floor, groaning, clutching his wrist. For one impossible moment, all 4 of them held still in the cold garage, the only sound the buzzing fluorescent tube above the workbench and the distant tick of the truck engine idling outside. Halvorson looked from Mark to Lisa, and then to the envelope bulging under Mark's jacket. He understood immediately. "Well," he said, and his voice was flat now, emptied of surprise. "That's bad." Mark kept the pistol trained on him. "Step back." Halvorson did not move. "You have no idea what you're standing in." "I know enough." "No, son." The sheriff's mouth twitched, like he almost felt sorry for him. "You know just enough to get yourself killed." Lisa came up beside Mark, gripping the pry bar in both hands. Her face was white and streaked with tears, but her eyes were ferocious. "You killed my brother." Halvorson looked at her briefly, not cruelly, almost tired. "I didn't want Caleb dead. That's a lie." "No," he said. "That's the truth. Dead men create mess. Your brother created mess," Mark said. "Drop the gun." Halvorson slowly lifted his empty hand from the butt of his holstered weapon. "Let's think this through. You can start by getting on your knees." Halvorson gave a low, humorless laugh. "Mark, if you wanted to arrest me, you'd have called state investigators already. You didn't, which means part of you still hopes there's some version of this that makes sense." The words landed because they were true. Mark wanted an explanation that made the last hour into something less monstrous than it appeared. Halvorson had been a mentor, a fixture, one of the few people Mark thought operated by an old-fashioned code, even when it bent the rules. Seeing that same man standing over a looted pit in the middle of the night, with armed deputies at his side, felt like waking up in a house you know, and finding the walls moved. Talk then, Mark said. Fast. Halvorson's eyes flicked toward Travis, who was breathing hard on the floor, then toward Mercer, who had not yet reached for his own gun again. This county was dying long before either of you grew up enough to notice. Farms folding, businesses leaving, kids running to Wichita or Kansas City and never coming back. Then 3 years ago, we get wind of the state reservoir expansion and the pipeline access roads that come with it. Big money. Land values on the south edge were going to jump through the roof once the announcement went public. Lisa spat. So you stole from people. Halvorsen ignored her. I saw a chance to keep some of that money here, instead of letting outside developers strip it and vanish. By using dummy buyers and intimidating landowners, Mark said. Halvorsen's jaw flexed. By moving faster than the people who've been bleeding this place dry for 20 years. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. His voice hardened. You think county budgets fix things? You think bake sales and grant applications keep a town alive? I put together investors, local men who knew this county. Some deals got aggressive. Some records had to stay quiet. He nodded toward the broken floor. Then Caleb stumbled into paperwork he didn't understand and started playing both sides. Lisa's voice shook with rage. You had him shot. Halvorsen finally looked at her directly. I told Daniel Rourke to keep him contained until we could get the copies back. The name cut through the room. Mark frowned. Rourke works for you? Rourke works for himself. Ex-Fed, now private security and consulting. Halvorsen's expression soured. I hired him because he knows how to manage trouble without making a carnival out of it. Mark thought of the calm man in the diner, the half-shown badge, the way he had seemed more interested in information than grief. And at the fair? Halvorsen hesitated, and that tiny hesitation said, more than any confession. That was not the plan, he said. Then whose plan was it? Halvorsen glanced at Mercer. Wes Barlow had cousins. One of them, Shane, got stupid. Thought Caleb had cost their family enough. Lisa made a broken sound. Mark said, You're telling me some revenge-drunk salvage yard thug just happened to find Caleb tonight while your contractor was already on him? I'm telling you pressure brings idiots out of the woodwork. Halvorsen took a careful step sideways, hands still visible. And now I'm telling you this can still be contained. Contained, Lisa repeated. You keep saying that like my brother was a fuel leak. Halvorsen snapped back. Your brother stole copies from people with more reach than you understand. Silence hit after that. Even Mercer seemed uncomfortable. Mark heard the meaning underneath it. More reach, more people. Maybe Halvorsen was dirty, but not alone. The paperwork in the envelope might be the edge of something broader. Something reaching through county offices, contractors, judges. Maybe state connections. Caleb had not just wandered into local greed. He had stepped into a machine. Mark said, You going to arrest us? Halvorsen's face settled into something grim. I'd rather you hand over what you found and walk away tonight. And then I make sure nobody touches Lisa. I make sure Caleb's death stays on the books as what it was. A tragic fairground homicide with a known suspect. I make sure you keep your pension and don't spend the next 10 years explaining why you assaulted fellow deputies in a private garage. Lisa laughed in disbelief. You think we're bargaining? Halvorsen's eyes moved back to Mark. I think you're smart enough to understand survival. That word hit something raw. Mark had spent most of his adult life confusing duty with endurance, mistaking the ability to absorb damage for moral strength. He thought of Aaron telling him during their last real fight, You don't protect people, Mark. You just learn how to stand next to wreckage and act noble about it. He had hated her for saying it because it felt cruel. He hated her now because it felt useful. Halvorsen was offering him the old version of himself. Stay quiet. Minimize harm. Call it realism. Let the system digest the truth. Because fighting it would crush everyone faster. Mark looked at Travis on the floor, young and terrified, and at Mercer holding his bleeding face with the dull shock of a man who had expected obedience and found resistance. He looked at Lisa, who had lost her brother and still stood with the pry bar like fury itself was keeping her upright. Then he heard the faintest sound outside, a vehicle rolling slowly over gravel that had not been there a moment earlier. Halvorsen heard it too. His head turned toward the open door. Headlights flashed across the yard again, brighter, closer. A horn chirped once. Mercer cursed under his breath. Halvorsen's eyes narrowed. Who did you call? Mark hadn't called anyone, but Lisa had a phone in her coat pocket, and for a split second he thought maybe she had texted somebody without him seeing. Then a voice rang from outside, sharp and amplified by the night. Don, step away from the building. Halvorsen went still. Mark recognized the voice after a beat. Daniel Rourke. Son of a bitch, Halvorsen muttered. Mercer moved instinctively toward the door, but Rourke shouted, "Don't do that. There are rifles on the tree line, and I am not in a forgiving mood." Halvorsen's face went dark with a kind of personal betrayal. "He sold me out," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Mark nearly laughed from pure disbelief. "You hired a liar and he lied?" Halvorsen ignored him, calculating now. Rourke called again. "Mark Ellison, if you're inside, I know you have the packet. Bring it out, and nobody else needs to bleed," Lisa hissed. "Do not trust him." Mark didn't, but he trusted Halvorsen less, and the sudden split between predators was the first real opening they had seen all night. Halvorsen's shoulders lowered a fraction. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Rourke doesn't care about justice. He wants leverage. He's been squeezing all sides for a payout from the beginning." "And you?" Mark said. Halvorsen gave him a bleak half-smile. "At least I live here." Then everything broke at once. Mercer lunged for his weapon. Mark fired first, the shot slamming into the concrete near Mercer's boot and throwing up chips. Lisa swung the pry bar into Travis's holstered sidearm before he could get to it. Halvorsen drew clean and fast, but before he could aim, red laser dots jittered across the garage wall and a rifle cracked from outside. The fluorescent tube exploded overhead in a burst of glass. Darkness swallowed the room except for moonlight and flashlights rolling wildly across the floor. Mercer screamed. Someone slammed into Mark from the side. He hit the ground hard enough to lose the pistol. Boots pounded. Lisa shouted his name. A second rifle shot boomed from outside, followed by Rourke's voice ordering everyone to drop weapons. Mark grappled blindly with a body that smelled like sweat and gun oil until he realized it was Travis, panicked and half-crying, trying to pin him more than shoot him. Mark drove an elbow into the younger man's throat and shoved him off. In the confusion, he saw Halvorsen silhouetted in the doorway, gun in one hand, the other arm grabbing Lisa by the coat and dragging her toward the yard. "No!" Mark lunged after them, slipping on shattered glass. Cold air hit him as he burst outside. The yard was chaos under crossing headlights. Rourke stood behind the engine block of a black SUV with a rifle shouldered. Two other men in tactical jackets flanked the tree line just as he had threatened. Mercer was on one knee by the garage wall, holding his leg and swearing. Travis staggered out behind Mark with both hands up. Halvorsen had Lisa in front of him now, his revolver pressed against the side of her neck, backing toward his own truck. "Everybody stop," he barked, and even the night seemed to obey. Lisa's eyes found Mark's across the yard. They were huge with terror, but there was something else there too. Something furious and stubborn. Rourke lowered his rifle just enough to speak. "Don, this is finished." Halvorsen laughed once, harsh and exhausted. "Finished? You were going to sell copies to Topeka, and then to the same developers you pretended to protect me from. That was before Shane Barlow lost control at the fair." "No." Halvorsen shook his head. "That was before you realized the packet wasn't where Caleb told you it would be." Rourke didn't answer, and that silence told Mark Halvorsen was right. The envelope under Mark's jacket suddenly felt like a live explosive. Everybody here wanted it for a different reason, and Caleb had died because he tried to outsmart men who treated information like currency and people like sandbags. Mark stepped forward one pace. "Let her go." Halvorsen's gaze snapped to him. "You still think there's a good ending?" "No," Mark said. "I think they're not weak, not broken, just old, in the way powerful men do when their certainty starts leaking out faster than they can patch it. You know what happens if those papers go public?" he said. "This county gets gutted. Federal hearings, asset freezes. The water project stalls. Every family sitting on promised sale money gets nothing for years. And what happens if they don't?" Lisa said through clenched teeth. "You keep deciding who gets crushed quietly?" Halvorsen's grip on her tightened, but his eyes flickered. He had known her since she was a child too. That mattered less than it should have, but not nothing. Rourke said, "Don, you're surrounded. The best deal you get is alive and talking." Halvorsen cut him a look of contempt. "From you?" Rourke shrugged faintly. "From whoever gets to write the first report." The cynicism of that line clarified everything for Mark. Rourke was not rescue. He was competition. Different suit, same appetite. Mark felt suddenly clear in a way he had not since the gunshot at the fair. No one here was going to save this. No institution. No badge. No old loyalty. There was only choice and consequence. He slowly reached inside his jacket. Every weapon in the yard pointed tighter. Halvorsen's face sharpened. "Don't be stupid." Mark pulled out the envelope. "This is what everybody wants?" he said. "Fine." Before anyone could react, he ripped the flash drive off the index card and hurled the papers themselves into the muddy oil drum fire pit beside the garage, where someone had burned scrap wood weeks earlier and left a little rainwater at the bottom. The papers hit water and black ash, smearing instantly. Rourke shouted, "Damn it!" Halvorson's face went white with fury. In that fractional break, Lisa moved. She slammed the heel of her boot straight down onto Halvorson's instep and drove her elbow backward into his ribs. His gun hand jerked. Mark threw the flash drive not at Rourke or the tree line but deep into the dark field beyond the trucks. Everyone's eyes tracked it by reflex. One stupid human twitch toward the thing they valued most. Mark lunged. Rourke fired. Halvorson fired. The shots overlapped so tightly they sounded like one. Lisa dropped. Halvorson staggered backward. Mark hit him low around the waist, and both men crashed into the dirt beside the truck tire. The revolver skidded away. Halvorson was stronger than Mark remembered, heavy and desperate, all blunt force survival. He drove a forearm into Mark's jaw and rolled on top of him. "You ruined it," he snarled, face inches away. "For what?" Mark tasted blood and answered with the only thing left in him, "Because Caleb trusted me." Halvorson's expression changed, not softened exactly, but altered by something like disbelief. Then a third shot cracked from somewhere to their left, and Halvorson jerked hard. The strength went out of him all at once. He collapsed across Mark's chest. Mark shoved him aside and pushed up on one elbow. Sheriff Don Halvorson lay in the dirt, staring at the sky. A dark stain spreading across the front of his coat. Near the SUV, Rourke stood with his rifle lowered, face unreadable. "He was reaching," Rourke said, though nobody had asked. Mark scrambled toward Lisa on his knees. She was curled on her side in the gravel, breathing in little shocked gasps. One hand clamped to her upper arm. Blood soaked her sleeve. Not the neck, the shoulder. Through the ringing in his ears, Mark shouted for an ambulance, though he had no idea who among this collection of liars and opportunists would actually call one. Travis finally seemed to come back to himself. "I got service," he said hoarsely, fumbling for his phone. Mercer sat propped against the garage wall, pale and shaking. Rourke walked closer, not hurrying, watching Mark with the careful patience of a man recalculating his leverage. "Where'd you throw it?" he asked. Mark pressed both hands around Lisa's wound. She hissed in pain and grabbed his wrist hard enough to bruise. "Don't answer him," she said through her teeth. Rourke crouched a few yards away. "You think this ends because Don's dead?" His voice was almost gentle now, which made it uglier. "There are copies somewhere. Names, accounts. Enough to blow up more than one courthouse. You need somebody who knows how to keep this from getting buried." Mark looked at him and saw the appeal for what it was. Another version of management, another man asking for faith while standing on a pile of compromises. "Get away from us," Mark said. Rourke studied him, then looked toward the dark field where the flash drive had vanished. Wind moved through the dry grass in restless waves. "You threw the only clean copy. Maybe. Or maybe you kept another. Maybe." A faint smile touched Rourke's mouth, as if he respected stubbornness even while planning around it. Sirens wailed in the distance at last, growing louder over the fields. Red and blue light would be here soon. And with it, statements, sealed scenes, stories competing to become official truth. Mark bent closer to Lisa. "Stay with me." She let out a weak laugh that turned into a groan. "I hate that line." "Yeah? Means things are bad." He almost said sorry, but the word had worn thin. Instead, he adjusted pressure on the wound and kept his body between her and everyone else. Over his shoulder, he heard Travis on the phone, voice breaking as he tried to explain officer down, shots fired, multiple injuries at the Whitaker property. Rourke stood and backed away slowly toward his SUV, already returning to strategy. Halvorson lay still in the dirt. The night smelled of diesel, blood, cold soil, and wet ash. Mark looked out at the dark field where he had thrown the flash drive and understood that the story Caleb died trying to hand him was no longer just evidence. It was burden. It was obligation without a clean road attached. And if there were other copies, other names, other hands in the county and beyond, then tonight was not resolution. It was exposure. It was the moment the rot split open enough for air to get in. And air did what it always did when it touched something rotten. It made the smell impossible to ignore. The ambulances arrived first, then county units from the far side of the district, then 2 state troopers because Travis, in his panic, had used the phrase "officer down" and shots fired involving a sheriff, which pulled more attention than Halvorson would ever have wanted. The yard turned into a storm of flashlights, radio chatter, boots, shouted instructions, and the metallic slam of gurney wheels over uneven ground. Mark never let go of Lisa's arm until a paramedic physically moved his hands aside and said, "Sir, if you want her to keep that much blood, you need to let me do my job." He stumbled back, palms slick red again, and watched them cut her coat sleeve open with trauma shears. Lisa stayed awake through pure anger. "Don't let him talk to them alone," she muttered, eyes fixed somewhere over Mark's shoulder. "I'm not dying, so don't start acting guilty." Then they loaded her onto the stretcher and wheeled her toward the ambulance with an IV bag already hanging. Mark tried to follow, but a state trooper blocked him with an open hand and asked for his weapon. Only then did he realize he was still holding Travis's pistol. He surrendered it butt first. The trooper's expression tightened when he checked the serial number and saw it belonged to a deputy. "What happened here?" he asked. Mark looked past him at Halverson's body under a thermal blanket, at Mercer being bandaged on the ground, at Rourke, talking calmly to another trooper as if he had stumbled into a business conference instead of an armed disaster. "That depends who writes it down first," Mark said. The trooper stared at him, deciding whether that was attitude or warning. "You need medical?" "No." "You hit your head?" "No." "Then sit on the tailgate and do not leave." Mark did as told because the command had the clean impersonality of state law, and right then he preferred that to any local authority. He sat on the open tailgate of a cruiser with dried blood on his shirt and dirt packed into his knuckles while the machinery of official reaction spun around him. A county coroner's van arrived. Someone from the sheriff's office cried when they saw the sheeted body, and then immediately looked ashamed of crying in front of troopers. Travis gave a statement in bursts, stammering, face gray from shock and pain. Mercer, after one look from Rourke, kept saying he remembered very little. That was when Mark understood Rourke was still trying to manage the shape of the night. Even with Halverson dead, the man adapted fast, too fast to be harmless. An hour later, just before dawn began thinning the eastern sky, a woman in a dark overcoat stepped out of an unmarked sedan and changed the temperature of the whole yard without raising her voice once. She was maybe in her late 40s, compact, controlled, with dark hair pulled back, and a face that looked built for patience rather than warmth. She showed credentials to the troopers and then walked straight toward Rourke. They spoke in low tones for less than 30 seconds before her gaze cut across the yard and landed on Mark. Rourke did not look pleased. She approached him without hurry. "Deputy Ellison?" "Formerly, maybe," Mark said. Her mouth moved almost imperceptibly at that. "Special Agent Elena Vasquez, Department of Justice." He looked past her toward Rourke. "Actual federal?" "Yes. Good to know that still exists." Her eyes flicked once to the blood on his shirt, then back to his face. "Mr. Rourke is not employed by the federal government." "I figured that out." "I'm sure you did." She stayed standing while he sat, which should have made the exchange feel lopsided, but somehow the imbalance worked the other way. She radiated the kind of composure that made everyone else look messy. "I understand Sheriff Halvorsen is dead," she said. "I understand there is a deceased civilian from earlier this evening at the county fair. One Caleb Whitaker, who may have been attempting to disclose information regarding land acquisition fraud and public corruption tied to the pending reservoir expansion. I also understand there was material hidden at this property, and some portion of it may now be missing or destroyed. I'd like you to tell me what's true." The sky behind her was turning the color of cold steel. Mark rubbed his hands over his face. Exhaustion hid in waves now, but under it was something harder, a refusal that had been tempering itself since the fairground gravel. "Before I say anything," he said, "I want to know Lisa Whitaker gets real protection and not a local deputy parked outside her room taking notes for whoever's left." Vasquez nodded once. "Reasonable. And I want Rourke nowhere near whatever statement I give." "Also reasonable. And if I tell you something that makes your life complicated, I don't want to hear later that it vanished into an interagency misunderstanding." For the first time, something like a human reaction crossed her face, not quite a smile. More an acknowledgement that he was not as easy to handle as he looked. "Mr. Ellison, my life is already complicated. That ship sailed before dawn." She crouched then, bringing herself to eye level. "What I need from you is not faith. I need sequence. Facts. Names, if you have them, the rest I can build." Mark thought of all the men who had asked him for trust in the last 6 hours, all the men who treated truth as a substance to own rather than reveal. Vasquez had asked for facts instead. It was not enough to make him trust her. It was enough to start. So he told her, not everything in one breath, because the story had too many knots, but the shape of it. Caleb's last words. Rourke at the diner with his fake badge flash. The lockbox. The phone. The message about the garage floor. The broken door. The dug-up pit. The envelope. Halvorsen's explanation. The names on the transfer sheet he remembered before he ruined the papers. Don Halvorsen Holdings. The sheriff's office forfeiture account. Judge Pritchard as a maybe from Caleb's note. Rourke listening from somewhere in the edges like a hired wolf who had smelled money. He told her about throwing the papers into ash water and the flash drive into the field. He did not know whether destroying the papers had been brave or stupid or both. He only knew it had broken everyone's script at once, and maybe that had saved Lisa's life. Vasquez interrupted only to clarify dates, spellings, exact wording. When he mentioned the flash drive, she looked toward the dark field beyond the Whitaker garage. "We've already got a grid team coming," she said. "And if Rourke's men found it first?" "Then they didn't leave with it," she said, glancing at the sealed perimeter. "Not without me knowing." Mark believed she believed that. Whether that made it true remained to be seen. By the time he finished, dawn had fully broken over the fields. The farmhouse looked smaller in daylight, more pitiful than haunted. The garage was just a cracked old outbuilding again. It bothered Mark how ordinary corruption looked once the adrenaline drained out of it. No grand architecture, just cinder block, county trucks, middle-aged men with mortgages, deciding that theft sounded better if you called it development. Vasquez stood. "You need sleep," she said. "You need a lawyer," Mark answered. "Probably." She handed him a business card. "You should still come to the hospital after they check you. Lisa Whitaker is in surgery. Through and through, upper arm. It missed the joint. She got lucky." Mark exhaled through his teeth. Lucky was not the word he would have chosen, but he took the relief anyway. Vasquez nodded toward the field. "One more thing. You said Caleb wrote. I wasn't skimming. Why do you think he phrased it like that?" Mark looked out across the dead grass shining with morning frost. "Because he thought whoever found the note might assume he took money." "Did he?" Mark considered the man he had known in pieces for 30 years. Caleb lied easily, stole when cornered, ran from shame by talking louder than it. But there had always been lines he hated in himself, even when he crossed them. "Maybe a little," Mark said at last. "Enough to think he could get clear, not enough to outrun what he was in." Vasquez slipped the card into his shirt pocket herself, because his hands were still shaking. "That may matter later," she said. Then she walked away to make other people nervous. Mark drove to Cedar Ridge Memorial under a pale morning sun that felt wrong for the amount of damage already done. The hospital parking lot was half full with pickups, minivans, and the battered sedans of people who could not afford better. Inside, everything smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. A volunteer in a pink cardigan tried to stop him at the desk until he gave Lisa's name, at which point she softened and pointed him towards surgery waiting. He found himself alone in a room with beige walls, an old TV bolted in the corner playing a morning weather report on mute, and a coffee machine that made a sound like distant coughing. He sat, stood, sat again. He called Erin without fully deciding to. She answered on the fourth ring, voice thick with sleep and surprise. "Mark?" "Yeah." A pause. "It's 6:30 in the morning." "I know. Are you okay?" The question hit somewhere he was not prepared to have hit. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "No." She went quiet. In the silence, he could hear sheets rustling on her end, the small life he no longer belonged to adjusting around his voice. "What happened?" she asked. He looked through the waiting room window at a vending machine humming under fluorescent lights. "A friend got killed, then some other things happened." "That sounds like you're in shock." "Probably." She let out a long breath. "Do you need me to call someone?" "No." Another pause. "Why did you call me?" Mark closed his eyes. Because when things broke open badly enough, there were only a few people in the world whose voices he could imagine reaching for without performing. Because she had once known all his versions, including the weak ones. Because guilt always made him nostalgic for the people he failed before. "I don't know," he said. "I think I needed somebody who knew me before tonight decides what I am." Erin was quiet for so long he thought maybe the call had dropped. Then she said, "You always do that." "Do what?" "Act like identity is something that gets assigned to you after the mess. Like you don't make it in the middle of the mess." He almost laughed, because that was exactly the kind of answer that used to make him furious when they were married. "Still giving speeches. Still calling me when you're bleeding into your own life." Her tone softened a little. "Did you do the right thing?" He stared at the tile floor. "I think I did the necessary thing." "That's not what I asked." "I know." He swallowed. "I don't know yet." "Well," she said, voice gentler now. "That's more honest than usual." It should have stung. Instead, it steadied him. They said goodbye without drama. No promises to talk later. No reopening of old wounds. Just two people who had loved each other badly in some ways, and still recognized the shape of each other's damage. An hour later, a surgeon in blue scrubs came into the waiting room and told him Lisa was awake, groggy, and mean enough to be a good sign. Mark laughed despite himself. When he entered her room, She looked pale under the blanket and angry at the IV pole, which did indeed feel reassuring. Her arm was bandaged thick from shoulder to elbow. She blinked at him through the haze of pain medication. "You look terrible." "You too." "Good." She shifted and winced. "Did they arrest you?" "Not yet." "Disappointing." He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat. Morning light filtered through half-closed blinds, striping the blanket and the linoleum floor. For the first time since the fair, the room held quiet that did not feel like threat, just exhaustion. Lisa watched him for a while. "Is Don dead?" "Yeah." She absorbed that without visible satisfaction. "Did he say anything before?" "Not much. He didn't mention the part where Halvorsen looked surprised that Caleb had trusted him. That line had lodged too deep." Lisa licked dry lips. "I keep trying to decide if I'm glad. And? I'm tired." "Yeah." She looked toward the window. "When we were kids, Caleb used to say Sheriff Halvorsen smelled like wintergreen and truck seats." Mark smiled faintly. "He did. After Dad got arrested that one time for fighting at the VFW, Caleb told everybody Halvorsen let him sit up front in the cruiser and listen to the radio. He thought that was the coolest thing that ever happened to him." Her mouth tightened. "That's what makes this feel sick. None of this starts with villains twirling mustaches. It starts with men people trust." Mark felt that land in his bones. "I know." She turned back to him. "No, you know now." The distinction was fair. For years he had believed knowing a town made him safe inside it, as if history functioned like armor instead of camouflage. Lisa let the silence stretch. "Do you think Caleb thought he could fix it?" "Part of him probably did. And the other part?" Mark looked down at his hands. "Cleaner now, but not clean. Probably thought he could profit and still tell himself he was smarter than the people around him." Lisa gave a weak, humorless smile. "That sounds like him." "Yeah." Her eyes filled suddenly, unexpectedly, as if the drugs had stripped away her last defenses. "I hated him sometimes." Mark said nothing. "Not every day, but enough." Tears slid into her hairline. He'd promise stuff, then vanish. Then, come back bleeding, or drunk, or sorry, or all three. "I spent half my life being angry at him, and the other half feeling guilty for being angry." Her voice broke. "And now he's dead, and everybody's acting like grief is supposed to wash all that clean." Mark leaned forward. "It doesn't." She stared at him. "No," he said. "It doesn't. You can love somebody and still be relieved every time their phone doesn't ring because you're scared of what they need. You can miss them and still be furious." Lisa let out a shaky breath. "That sounds rehearsed. Maybe I've been practicing for years." He thought of Caleb at 17, laughing with a bloody knuckle. Caleb at 22, furious in the holding cell when Mark told him cooperating was his best option. Caleb last month outside the gas station, saying, "You still walk around like the world owes you honesty because you finally became the good son." Mark had almost swung at him for that. Instead, they bought cigarettes and stood in the cold, not speaking until Caleb muttered, "You ever get tired of trying to be the man people need?" Mark had said, "You ever get tired of making it impossible?" It had felt like winning then. Now it felt like the kind of conversation men have when they think they'll have another chance. Lisa drifted asleep mid-afternoon. Mark stayed in the chair until Vasquez arrived with 2 paper cups of hospital coffee and a file folder tucked under her arm. He met her in the hallway outside the room. She got to the point. "We found the flash drive. In the field, 20 yards north of the fence line. Muddy, but readable." Something inside him unclenched and then immediately tightened again. "What's on it?" "Copies of transfer ledgers, property options, email screenshots, and audio." "Audio?" Vasquez opened the folder and showed him a waveform printout and a typed summary. Caleb recorded a meeting on his phone 3 weeks ago at Halvorsen Excavation. Voices preliminarily identified as Sheriff Halvorsen, Judge Pritchard, a regional developer named Curtis Vale, and Daniel Rourke. Mark read the summary. Fragments leaped out. Option agreements. Pressure on holdouts. Make the appraisals hurt. Keep Whitaker close until he gives back the originals. Mark looked up. "That's enough?" "Enough to open warrants and freeze things before they scatter, yes." "And Rourke?" "Gone." She said it with controlled irritation. "Left the scene before sunrise while uniformed personnel were busy with bodies and ambulances. So he wins." "No." Vasquez's voice sharpened. "He runs. That is not the same thing." She held his gaze. "We arrested Judge Pritchard 40 minutes ago. State ethics agents are executing warrants on 2 county offices. The developer's plane was stopped at Salina. There will be indictments. Whether Mr. Rourke gets to a border first is a separate problem." Mark leaned against the wall, suddenly lightheaded from fatigue. Nurses passed at the far end of the corridor, pushing a medicine cart, unaware that whole local power structures were folding in real time just beyond the hospital gift shop. "How bad is it?" he asked. Vasquez's expression remained careful. "Bad enough that some people who thought they were just making smart land moves are going to discover the phrase conspiracy count in a very personal way. Not bad enough to fix what it broke." Meaning? She looked through the small window into Lisa's room, where Lisa slept under thin sunlight. Meaning, if the reservoir expansion survives, it will be delayed. If it dies, some families who planned their futures around the sale money will blame whoever exposed the scheme. If it goes forward under review, those same families will wait years and curse the process instead of the corruption. There is no version where this county thanks you in unison. Mark almost smiled. "Yeah, that tracks." Vasquez closed the folder. "One more complication. The ledgers suggest Caleb did move small amounts through an intermediary account. Nothing like the others. Enough to dirty him? Enough for defense counsel to make him look like a thief, not a whistleblower." Mark stared at the floor tiles. "He probably was both. That's my assessment." "And you're telling me because?" "Because when this becomes public, the town will simplify him into whatever story hurts least." Her voice softened a fraction. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys simplified stories." He thought about that. Caleb would be called a rat by some, a crook by others, a victim by people who needed cleaner grief than the truth allowed. Maybe that was inevitable. But maybe the only real dignity left was complexity. "What happens to me?" he asked. "Internal review on the shooting. Administrative leave if the county can still process paperwork. Then probably invitations from multiple lawyers. That sounds expensive." "It usually is." She handed him her card again, this time with a handwritten number on the back. "This one reaches me directly. Use it before anyone local offers to help." Caleb's warning came back so sharply, it almost felt physical. "Don't trust anybody who says they can handle it quietly." Mark slipped the card into his wallet. "You know," he said, "for someone who keeps saying reasonable a lot, you don't sound very optimistic." "Optimism is for press conferences," Vasquez said. "I prefer outcomes." Then she walked away, leaving him in the hospital corridor with the coffee cooling in his hand, and the sense that the final arc of all this had begun not with a triumph, but with paperwork, testimony, headlines, neighbors choosing sides, and the long, terrible work of deciding what truth cost after the gunfire stopped. Then she walked away, leaving him in the hospital corridor with the coffee cooling in his hand, and the sense that the final arc of all this had begun not with a triumph, but with paperwork, testimony, headlines, neighbors choosing sides, and the long, terrible work of deciding what truth cost after the gunfire stopped. By late afternoon, the local stations out of Wichita had the story in pieces. County sheriff killed in shooting tied to corruption probe. Fairground homicide connected to land fraud investigation. Cedar Ridge officials under scrutiny. The phrases rolled cleanly across television screens in waiting rooms and bar corners and checkout lines, flattening men in decades and blood into lower third graphics. Mark watched one segment from the hospital cafeteria while picking at a sandwich he couldn't taste. The anchor called Caleb Whitaker a possible cooperating witness. Mark almost laughed at the neatness of it. Caleb would have hated that phrasing. He would have said it made him sound weak and important at the same time. The two things he spent his whole life fighting. He drove home just before dark to shower and change, because dried blood had started to feel like a costume that kept trying to tell him who he was. His rental house sat on the edge of town in a row of low beige duplexes near the highway, a place chosen less for comfort than because it required no imagination. Inside, the silence was so complete, it made the refrigerator hum sound accusatory. He stripped in the bathroom and stood under scalding water until his skin turned red. Dirt swirled down the drain. So did the smell of gunpowder, or maybe that part had lodged deeper. On the sink sat the business card Vasquez had given him. Beside it was his wedding band in a ceramic dish, where it had sat for months because he still had not decided whether taking it off every day counted as acceptance or cowardice. He stared at both objects a long time. One belonged to the past he had failed. The other belonged to the future he had not agreed to. Neither felt like absolution. When he got back to the hospital, Lisa was sitting up in bed eating lime gelatin, with the distrustful expression of someone who suspected it had been made by a committee. "You look slightly less haunted," she said. "That's the best I can do." She set the spoon down. There were shadows under her eyes now, that no amount of rest would fix quickly. "I talked to Agent Vasquez." "Yeah?" "She says they're moving Mom's old house into some kind of temporary protection setup once I'm discharged." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Which apparently means a state car nearby, and people I don't know, pretending not to watch the porch." Mark sat in the chair by the bed. "That might be wise." "I know." Her face tightened. I just hate that wise is the word now. He nodded. Me too. She studied him for a moment. You heard from anybody? A lot of missed calls. Who? He leaned back and looked at the ceiling. County HR. 2 reporters. My ex-wife. Travis Boone's uncle. Somebody from the union rep office. And 3 people from town pretending they just wanted to check how I was doing. Lisa gave a tired smile, which means they were fishing. Yeah. Anybody say Caleb's name like he mattered? Mark thought about that. Mostly they say the Whitaker boy, or your friend, or the deceased male at the fair. Lisa nodded as if that confirmed something ugly she already knew. That's how it starts. They turn him into a role so they don't have to feel bad about the person. Mark looked at her. She stared out the blinds toward the parking lot where evening lights were coming on. When Dad died, she said, people told me he was complicated, like that was comforting. What they meant was he was mean when he drank and generous when he was sober and impossible to summarize in a casserole note. Her mouth tightened. I don't want that for Caleb. I don't want him polished into innocence, and I don't want him used as a trash can for everybody else's guilt. Then don't let them. Easy for you to say. No, Mark said quietly. It isn't. They fell silent. Down the hallway, an intercom called a doctor to labor and delivery. Somewhere a child cried and was soothed. Life kept conducting its ordinary business, indifferent to scandal. Lisa picked up the spoon again, then put it down without eating. Do you ever think about leaving for real? She asked. Not transfer. Not 6 months. I mean just going somewhere nobody knows your last name or your high school stats or who you bailed out in 2009. Mark gave a small shrug. I did. In Topeka. That's not leaving for real. That's commuting from your ghosts. He smiled despite himself. Maybe. She looked back at him. I used to think Caleb was the one who couldn't leave. But I'm starting to think some people stay because they believe familiarity is the same thing as belonging. The words settled hard, because they matched something he had been circling all day without naming. Cedar Ridge had always felt like a map he carried in his body. Streets, names, grudges, church picnics, football scores, funerals. He had mistaken his fluency in the place for moral knowledge. Maybe staying had never made him loyal. Maybe it only made him legible to people who knew how to use him. Vasquez wants me in Wichita tomorrow, he said. Formal statement. Grand jury prep? Maybe later. Lisa nodded. Go. You'll be okay here? No. She held his gaze. But go anyway. He visited the Whitaker house the next morning because Lisa asked him to bring her a sweater, and because part of him needed to see the place in daylight before state movers and evidence teams and protective detail logistics turned it into an administrative fact. The house looked small and overexposed in the morning sun. Someone had already left flowers on the porch. Someone else had left an envelope with no stamp. Just Lisa, written on the front in looping church lady handwriting. Grief in a town like this arrived in edible containers and unanswered questions. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. Mark found the sweater draped over the back of a dining chair. On the fridge was a magnet calendar with dentist appointments, a church rummage sale, and Caleb's birthday still marked from 3 months earlier in blue ink. He stood there longer than he meant to. In the hall closet, where the lockbox had been kept, a pair of Caleb's old work boots sat abandoned on the floor. One lace was broken. Mark picked one up and turned it in his hands. Mud dried into the tread. The boot felt heavier than it should. He almost put it back, then frowned and reached inside. His fingers touched folded paper, stuffed deep in the toe. He pulled it free, slowly. It was a receipt from a copy store in Salina, dated 2 weeks earlier, paid cash for scan to encrypted media, 1 set. On the back, in Caleb's handwriting, were 4 words. Rosie knows which key. Mark stared at the message until his pulse started climbing. Not a new major conflict, he told himself automatically. Just another consequence. Another piece Caleb had scattered because he did not trust any single hiding place. He put the receipt in his pocket, took the sweater, and locked the house behind him. Rosie was refilling ketchup bottles when he walked into the diner at 10:30. The lunch rush hadn't started. Country music played low from the kitchen radio. She looked up, saw his face, and stilled. You should be sleeping. Probably. He slid into the same back booth where he and Lisa had sat the night Caleb died. Rosie came over with coffee before he asked. Her hand lingered near the pot when she noticed the change in his expression. What? She said. He took the receipt from his pocket and laid it on the table. What key did Caleb mean? For a second, she did not move. The whole diner seemed to hold itself very still around them. Then Rosie sat across from him, something she had maybe done twice in all the years he'd known her, and lowered her voice. I told him not to drag me into it. You already were. I know. She looked suddenly older than her 63 years. less the diner owner everyone called Miss Rosie, and more a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the price of other people's secrets. 3 weeks ago he came in after close. He was sweating through his shirt and talking too fast. Said if anyone asked, he'd never been there. Then he handed me a brass key on one of those motel tags from the highway star out on Route 8. Mark said nothing. She rubbed her thumb over the edge of the receipt. He told me, if he didn't come back for it in a week, I was supposed to give it to you. Not the sheriff, not Lisa, you. Mark stared at her. Why didn't you? Her eyes flashed with shame and anger. Because the next day, Sheriff Halverson had coffee right where you're sitting and asked real casual whether Caleb had been around talking strange. And I thought, whatever this is, it is above my pay grade. She swallowed. Then after the shooting, before you came in with Lisa, that Rourke man showed up first, asked the same questions, smiled too much. I got scared. So where's the key? Rosie reached under the front of her apron and pulled a small brass key on a red plastic tag with Room 12 stamped in white. She set it on the table between them. I was going to mail it somewhere, or throw it in Miller's Creek, or bring it to church and pray on it like that ever helps. Mark looked at the key and felt grief move through him in a strange, new way. Caleb had still been working a plan even while he was unraveling. Not a good plan, not a complete one, but enough to keep trying to outrun his own fear. What's in Room 12? Rosie shook her head. I never asked. And you never told anyone about this? I'm telling you now. Her eyes filled, though she did not cry. That boy used to come in here at 16 and steal pie off cooling racks because he thought I didn't see him. I saw him. I just let him think he was charming. She pushed the key closer. Whatever's there, don't make me know, unless I have to. Mark picked it up. The plastic tag was warm from her skin. Thank you. Rosie gave him a hard look. Don't thank me like I did something brave. I waited too long. He almost told her everybody had. Instead, he stood, left cash for the coffee he barely touched, and drove out to the highway star alone. The motel sat 2 miles past the county line, a low strip of faded rooms facing a gravel lot with potholes full of old rainwater. Its sign buzzed weakly in the daylight. A soda machine leaned against the office wall, with out of order taped across the front, the kind of place where no one looked twice at cash, fake names, or men carrying too much worry in a duffel. Mark parked near Room 12 and scanned the lot before getting out. No state cars, no black SUVs, just an 18-wheeler idling at the far edge and a woman in slippers smoking outside Room 6. He unlocked the door and stepped into a room that smelled of bleach layered over old cigarettes. The bedspread was floral and thin. The curtains were shut. A Bible sat in the nightstand drawer. For a moment, it looked like nothing. Then he saw the ceiling tile above the bathroom door had been nudged crooked. He dragged a chair over, stood on it, and pushed the tile aside. A manila mailing envelope slid down into his hands. Inside was a stack of printed emails, a second flash drive, and a small spiral notebook. The notebook mattered most immediately because it was unmistakably Caleb's, with his blunt handwriting and random all-caps emphasis. Most pages were numbers, dates, initials, little maps of who paid, whom, and when. On one page he had written, "If Dawn falls, Rourke runs to Vale. If Rourke falls, Dawn blames Barlow's. If I fall, maybe Mark still does the right thing even if he hates me for making him." Mark sat on the edge of the motel bed with the notebook open in his hands and stared at that sentence until his vision blurred. It was such a Caleb line. Half manipulative, half sincere, trying to force love and obligation into the same box and act like that counted as strategy. Underneath it, in smaller writing, Caleb had added, "Tell Lisa I was sorry about the door." Mark let out a sound that was almost a laugh and almost grief tearing loose in the same motion. He closed the notebook and sat there breathing shallowly, while the motel air conditioner kicked on with a hard rattle. He thought about all the versions of Caleb people would build now. Rat, crook, witness, screw-up, victim. Every one of them partly true and still not enough. The closest thing to truth might have been that Caleb had spent his life making damage and still, in the end, tried to aim some part of himself toward repair. It did not save him. It did not excuse him, but maybe it mattered. Mark called Vasquez from the motel room. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me you're somewhere public." "Motel on Route 8. That is not public." "I found another packet." "A beat. Stay where you are." "I'm not waiting around for Mark." Her voice sharpened in a way that cut straight through his resistance. "Do not improvise. I am 22 minutes away." She arrived in 17 with 2 agents and a patient that looked visibly strained when she saw the motel sign. They photographed everything, bagged the contents, and took preliminary possession while letting Mark keep the notebook long enough to read her the most relevant pages. When he got to the line about doing the right thing, she looked at him carefully, but said nothing. In the car on the drive back to Wichita, she finally asked, "Do you hate him for making you?" Mark looked out the passenger window at flat winter fields unspooling under a white sky. Sometimes. And now? He thought about the fairground gravel, the garage, Lisa bleeding, Rosie sitting down at his booth because fear had finally turned to conscience, the county about to split into camps of denial and rage. Now I think he knew me too well. Vasquez drove a mile before responding. That tends to be what makes family stories dangerous. He wasn't family. No? Mark considered saying no quickly. It would have been simpler. Instead, he said, "Close enough to do permanent damage. That usually counts." In Wichita, they put him in a conference room with a recorder, legal pads, and a lawyer appointed through the union who looked too caffeinated to trust but turned out to be competent. He gave the long statement, then another clarifying one, then identified voices from the audio as best he could. Hours passed. By evening, his tongue felt thick from repetition. When he finally emerged into the cold outside the federal building, the sky had gone indigo. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "They let me watch the news. Apparently, we're a limited series now. Come by if you're not arrested." He smiled despite everything and drove back to Cedar Ridge under a sky so clear the stars looked cruel. Lisa was being discharged the next morning. State protection had become visible now, no more pretending. A sedan idled across from the Whitaker house. Another sat half a block down. Neighbors watched from porches with that shameless discretion, small towns perfect, staring openly while convincing themselves concern made it polite. When Mark carried Lisa's bag inside, she said, "I'm going to have to move, aren't I? Maybe for a while." "I hate when maybe means yes." He set the bag on the couch. The house felt changed, not because anything in it was different, but because every object had become evidence of continuity that could no longer be trusted. Lisa sank carefully into the armchair, cradling her bandaged arm. "Did he leave anything else?" Mark took out the notebook. "Yeah." She saw the cover and froze. "That's his. Found it in a motel room." He handed it over. Lisa opened to the page about the door because he had marked it silently with his thumb. She read, then covered her mouth with her good hand. Her eyes filled, but this time the tears seemed less explosive than tired, like water rising in ground that had already split. "That idiot," she whispered. "Yeah." She looked up at him. "You keeping it?" "It's yours." Lisa glanced back at the notebook. "No, it's his, which means neither of us gets to own it cleanly." She held it out. "You keep it for now. I can't decide what I want from him yet." Mark took it back, feeling the cheap spiral binding press into his palm. Outside, a dog barked at one of the state cars. The agent on the porch pretended not to hear. Lisa leaned her head back and closed her eyes. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Mark moved to the front window and looked out at Cedar Ridge in the weak winter sun. Across the street, Mrs. Holloway was pretending to prune dead mums while absolutely listening for any spoken word. Beyond her yard, the church steeple rose above the rooftops. Past that lay the courthouse square, where reporters would cluster by noon and where people would stand in little knots, insisting they'd always known something was off, or that this was all political, or that Don Halvorson had done more, good than bad, and how dare outsiders judge a man who kept the county afloat. The town would not heal cleanly. It would split, scar, adapt, and keep going because places do that even when they do not deserve the grace. "I don't know," Mark said. Then, because the truth had gotten expensive enough to be useful, he kept going. "I think I resign before they ask. I testify. I take whatever heat comes. After that." He looked down at the notebook in his hand. "After that, I stop pretending staying is the same thing as fixing." Lisa opened her eyes. "That sounds almost healthy. Don't spread it around." She gave a small, real laugh, the first one since the fair, and it broke his heart a little because it sounded like survival, not recovery. He went to Rosie's that evening on instinct more than appetite. The diner was half full, and conversation dipped when he walked in, then resumed in louder, false normal bursts. Rosie poured him coffee and said, "Pie's on the house, but only because I've decided guilt should have a menu item." He sat in the booth by the window. After a minute, she brought pecan pie anyway and slid into the opposite seat again. "They saying bad things yet?" she asked. "Depends who you ask. That means yes. Some say Caleb was crooked. Some say Halvorson was framed. Some say I went rogue because I had a grudge." Rosie nodded like she had expected no better. "And what do you say?" Mark looked out through the neon glow at the highway beyond town. Cars moving through darkness toward places that did not know Cedar Ridge existed. I say, a lot of people were more than one thing. Rosie followed his gaze. That's a hard sell these days. Yeah. He took a bite of pie and tasted sweetness for the first time in what felt like forever. It almost hurt. Rosie stood after a moment and squeezed his shoulder once before returning to the counter. Mark sat there until the diner thinned out and the coffee went cold. When he finally stepped outside, the air was sharp and clear. He could see his breath. Across the highway, a freight train moved slowly through the dark, each car clanking into the next with patient force. He stood by his truck with the notebook in his jacket pocket, and Caleb's last real trust still sitting heavy in his chest. There was no clean ending waiting for him. Lisa would have to rebuild her life around a brother she loved and resented in equal measure. The county would spend years sorting greed from necessity and fail half the time. Halvorson would be memorialized by some and cursed by others. Rourke might be caught, or might vanish into another job in another town, where men mistook efficiency for morality. Caleb would become story, argument, warning, and Mark would carry the knowledge that doing the right thing had not saved anybody in time, only kept the lie from hardening permanently. Maybe that was all duty ever really was. Not rescue, not redemption, just refusal. Refusal to let the worst version become the official one because everybody was too tired or afraid to fight for better. He got in the truck and started the engine. The road ahead led past the courthouse, past the fairgrounds, past the church and the gas station, and the old county line where boys once believed escape was just a matter of distance. He did not know yet whether he was leaving Cedar Ridge or finally seeing it clearly enough to stay on honest terms. But for the first time since the gunshot split open the night, he was not standing still.